New information has just surfaced about why Ghost Hunters really went dark. For 14 seasons and more than 200 episodes, Jason Hawes and the TAPS team built the most trusted name in paranormal investigation television. They were not entertainers chasing shadows. They were plumbers from Rhode Island who started a ghost hunting organization in their spare time and accidentally built a franchise that defined the genre for a generation. And then it stopped. Not the way shows stop when ratings decline or networks move on. It stopped the way things stop when something happens that the people involved cannot find a way to continue past. The mystery of why Ghost Hunters really shut down has been circulating in the paranormal research community for years without a satisfying answer. Tonight, that mystery has finally been solved. And what has come out in the last several hours about what really happened to Ghost Hunters is not what anyone who watched those 14 seasons was expecting to hear. Subscribe right now before we go any further. The complete story starts immediately. Before you can understand why Ghost Hunters shut down in the way that it did, you need to understand what Ghost Hunters actually was and why it occupied a position in the paranormal investigation genre that no show before or since has quite replicated. Ghost Hunters premiered on the Sci-Fi Channel on October 6, 2004. The premise was not complicated. Jason Hawes and Grant Wilson, co-founders of the Atlantic Paranormal Society, TAPS, along with a rotating roster of investigators, would travel to locations reported to be haunted, conduct systematic investigations using standard equipment, and arrive at conclusions based on evidence rather than assumption. What made the show different from the paranormal television that preceded it was not the locations or the equipment or the production quality, it was the methodology. Ghost Hunters was the first paranormal investigation show to build its identity around debunking. The default conclusion was that there was a rational explanation. The show's investigators looked for natural causes before entertaining supernatural ones. They were more likely to explain away a reported haunting than to confirm it, and that specific intellectual honesty, the willingness to tell a client that the sounds they were hearing were pipes and not spirits, was what built the show's credibility with an audience that was tired of being manipulated. Jason Hawes did not come to paranormal investigation through television. He came through a genuinely personal experience whose character he has described publicly on multiple occasions, and that shaped the specific seriousness with which he approached the work that Ghost Hunters documented. He was a plumber at Roto-Rooter. He was a family man in Warwick, Rhode Island. He founded TAPS in 1990 with Grant Wilson because the paranormal experiences that had shaped his personal life required an organized framework to investigate properly, not because a network had offered him a development deal. When Ghost Hunters put cameras on him, it was documenting something that already existed rather than creating something for television's benefit. That origin is the source of everything that made the show work and everything that made what eventually happened to it the specific kind of heartbreaking that the word heartbreaking was designed for. Ghost Hunters ran for 14 seasons. That number sounds straightforward until you understand what 14 seasons of paranormal investigation at the scale and the pace that the show required actually produced in the people conducting it. The TAPS team at Ghost Hunters' peak was not a team of professional entertainers who flew into locations, filmed for a weekend, and returned to ordinary lives between episodes. These were people who had built their identities around the investigation before the show existed and who continued to build them around it while the show was running. Their personal relationships, their professional networks, their daily rhythms were organized around the investigation in ways that the production schedule reinforced rather than created. What the show documented across 14 seasons was the surface of what the investigation produced: the locations, the evidence, the client interactions whose emotional weight the cameras captured but whose full dimension the format compressed into episode-length narratives. What the show did not document was the accumulation, the specific quality of what it produces in a person to spend years investigating locations associated with violent death, documented suffering, and the specific residual phenomena that those things leave behind. To spend years sitting with families whose experiences in their homes had produced genuine fear and genuine disruption, and who were counting on the investigation to provide either answers or resolution. To spend years doing all of that while the production schedule of a cable television show added the specific demands of continuous filming, travel, and public visibility to the already considerable demands of the investigation itself. Jason Hawes has spoken about the accumulation in terms that are characteristically understated for a man whose public presentation has always been defined by a certain careful restraint. The restraint is genuine, and it is the restraint of a person who understands that the full dimension of what the accumulation produced would take more than an interview format allows to convey honestly. Grant Wilson's departure from Ghost Hunters at the end of Season 7 in 2012 was presented publicly as a personal decision whose primary driver was his desire to spend more time with his family. That explanation was true as far as it went. It did not go far enough to account for the full dimension of what drove him to make the decision when he made it. People close to both Wilson and the production have described the specific character of what he was navigating in the period leading up to his departure in terms that the family time explanation does not capture, and that the show's audience deserves to understand in the context of what was happening inside the TAPS investigation during that period. Wilson had been experiencing things during Ghost Hunters investigations in the later seasons that his previous experience in the field had not prepared him for in the specific way that they were occurring. Not the standard anomalous events that the show documented and debunked and occasionally confirmed across hundreds of episodes. Something different. Something that the careful, skeptical methodology he and Hawes had built the show's identity around was producing results, with that the methodology was not designed to process. When you build a rigorous debunking framework and apply it consistently across years of investigation, and the framework consistently fails to account for a specific category of what you are encountering, the failure of the framework is itself information. Grant Wilson arrived at the information that the Ghost Hunters methodology was consistently failing to debunk a specific category of phenomena during the later seasons of the show's original run, and what that information produced in him, the specific reckoning of a deeply skeptical and deeply serious person confronting the persistent failure of their own methodology, was the real driver behind the decision that the family time explanation publicly described. He left the show. He pursued other interests. He returned to Ghost Hunters for its revival seasons, and what the people who worked closest to him across both periods of his involvement with the show have described as the specific quality of his relationship to the investigation after his return is different from what it was before his departure, in ways that the show's cameras documented without ever fully naming. At exactly 2:53 in the morning on the 14th of November 2018, during an investigation at a location in New England, whose identity the people discussing this have declined to specify, something happened to Jason Hawes that the 26 years of paranormal investigation he had conducted before that moment had not produced in him, and that the years since have not resolved. The investigation was not a Ghost Hunters production. The show's original run had concluded. Hawes was investigating independently, with a small team whose composition reflected the TAPS methodology he had built over decades, rather than the production requirements of a television show. The location had been brought to his attention by a contact whose credibility within the paranormal research community was established enough that Hawes considered the specific claims about the location worth investigating personally. What happened at 2:53 in the morning is something that the people who were present have described with a consistency whose specific character investigators who study witness testimony identify as the marker of genuine first-hand account, not a visual encounter, not a physical event that could be captured on any of the equipment the team had deployed. Something that Jason Hawes experienced in a way that the standard categories of paranormal investigation evidence are not designed to document. Something that communicated to him directly and specifically, and in a way that the 26 years of careful skepticism he had built his professional identity around could not process through any of the frameworks that identity provided. He has not spoken publicly about what happened at 2:53 in the morning on the 14th of November 2018. The people who were present have spoken about it only in terms that are careful and limited, and that consistently describe the aftermath, the specific quality of how Jason Hawes was changed by whatever occurred, rather than the event itself. One person who was there has said that the person who walked out of that building at 4:30 in the morning was not the same person who had walked in at 9 the previous evening. Not different in the way that frightening experiences make people different. Different in the way that understanding something changes a person, the understanding that cannot be undone. In the months following the November 2018 investigation, Jason Hawes began a process that the people closest to him in the paranormal research community noticed without initially understanding its significance. He began reviewing the TAPS archive, not reviewing it in the sense of organizing or cataloging the investigation records that the organization had accumulated across nearly 3 decades of documented fieldwork, reviewing it with the specific purpose of a person who has received information that recontextualizes everything that information preceded. Going back through the records, looking at cases whose conclusions the standard TAPS methodology had produced, and whose evidence, reviewed in the light of what the New England investigation had produced, looked different than it had when the conclusions were reached. The TAPS archive contains documentation of more than 4,000 investigations conducted across 3 decades of organized paranormal research. Jason Hawes and Grant Wilson built that archive through the consistent application of a methodology whose intellectual honesty and rigorous skepticism had made it the most credible investigative framework in the paranormal investigation genre. What Hawes found when he reviewed that archive in the months after the New England investigation is something that the people who have discussed it with him subsequently have been willing to characterize only in general terms. There is a pattern across the 4,000+ investigations, a pattern in the specific category of cases that the TAPS methodology had consistently failed to explain through natural causes, a pattern in the locations where that failure occurred, a pattern in the specific character of the phenomena that the methodology could document but not debunk, and a pattern in the effect that sustained exposure to those phenomena had produced in the investigators who had encountered them most frequently across the archive's 3 decades of records. Hawes has not disclosed what the pattern shows. The people who know he has identified it have not disclosed what it shows, but the specific quality of what it produced in him when he recognized it is something that the people describing his state in the period following the archive review have characterized in terms that are consistent and that collectively describe a man who has understood something that the understanding of changes the nature of the work that preceded it. Ghost Hunters was revived on A&E in 2019, 15 years after its original premiere. The public explanation for the revival was straightforward: audience demand, a new network home, the ongoing cultural appetite for paranormal investigation content that the show's Ghost Hunters had inspired had demonstrated remained strong. All of those things were true. They were not the complete explanation for why Jason Hawes agreed to bring the show back when he agreed to bring it back rather than at some other point. The timing of the revival, coming in the months after the archive review that followed the New England investigation, is a detail that the people who understand the full context of what Hawes was doing in that period have noted as significant. The revival seasons of Ghost Hunters were different from the original run in ways that the audience felt without always being able to name. The methodology was the same, the team was largely the same, the format was the same, but something in the specific quality of Hawes's engagement with the investigation had changed in ways that the cameras documented without the narrative framework of the show providing a context for what was being documented. He was looking for something specific in the revival seasons, the same pattern that the archive review had revealed, looking for it in new investigations rather than old records, applying the same methodology to new locations while carrying the specific knowledge of what the methodology had failed to account for across 3 decades of previous application. The revival seasons were not a commercial decision dressed up as a creative one. They were the continuation of an investigation whose direction the New England investigation and the archive review had permanently altered. The show came back because Hawes needed it to come back, because the investigation it allowed him to continue was the investigation that the pattern he had identified required him to continue. And what that investigation produced across the revival seasons is the part of the Ghost Hunter story that the mystery of its shutdown was always pointing toward. The investigation that produced the Ghost Hunter's shutdown did not take place during a production shoot. It did not occur at a location selected by a production team or sanctioned by a network. It occurred during what the production schedule described as a standard hiatus period, and what the people closest to Hawes describe as the investigation he had been building toward since the archive review 2 years earlier. The location had been identified through the pattern the review had revealed. It was one of the specific locations whose presence in the TAPS archive across multiple investigations spanning different years and different team compositions had contributed most significantly to the recognition of the pattern, a location that the TAPS methodology had visited and documented and failed to debunk across a 30-year span with results whose consistency the pattern made newly significant. Hawes went with 4 people he trusted, people whose experience with the investigation and whose personal discretion he was confident in. They deployed the standard TAPS equipment complement, the same instrumentation that 3 decades of investigation had refined into the most rigorous civilian paranormal investigation toolkit in existence. And they went into the location at dusk on a night whose specific date the people discussing this have declined to specify and whose location they have declined to name beyond confirming it exists in the northeastern United States and that it appears in the TAPS archive under multiple case numbers spanning more than 20 years of documented visits. What happened during the investigation that night is what the Ghost Hunter shutdown mystery was always pointing toward. The equipment documented things, the team experienced things, and at a specific point during the investigation, approximately 4 hours after their arrival, Jason Hawes had an experience whose character, the people he has described it to, have been extremely careful about discussing publicly. What they have said is that it was consistent with what he experienced at the New England location in November 2018. Consistent in character. escalated in intensity, and definitive in what it communicated to a person who had spent 30 years building a methodology for investigating exactly this category of experience, and who now understood, with the specific clarity of direct encounter rather than analytical inference, what the pattern he had identified in the archive was pointing toward. He left the location before dawn. He contacted Grant Wilson the following morning, and within 3 weeks, the decision had been made that ghost hunters would not continue in any form that required him to conduct the investigation publicly. The mystery of the shutdown has been solved, and the answer is not good. Grant Wilson's response to what Jason Hawes communicated to him in the days following the investigation at the unnamed northeastern location is the dimension of the ghost hunter's shutdown story that the public record has addressed least directly. The two men had built the investigation and the show together across 3 decades. Their professional relationship was the foundation of everything ghost hunters had produced. When Hawes called Wilson in the weeks following the investigation that ended the show, what he communicated was something that Wilson had his own framework for receiving. The departure in 2012, the specific reasons behind it that the family time explanation had always understated, the things that Wilson had been encountering in the later seasons of the original run that the methodology was failing to account for. All of it provided Wilson with a context for what Hawes was describing, that someone without that history would not have had. People who have spoken with Wilson in the period following Hawes's communication have described a man who received the information with a specific quality of recognition rather than surprise, not as though he was learning something new, as though he was receiving confirmation of something he had already arrived at through a different route. His response to Hawes, the conversation that produced the mutual decision not to continue Ghost Hunters in its investigative form, has been described as brief, not because the subject did not warrant a longer conversation, but because the two men had spent 3 decades together investigating a specific phenomenon and had arrived, through different experiences, at different times by different routes, at the same understanding of what the phenomenon was and what the understanding of it meant for the investigation going forward. The conversation was brief because they did not need to convince each other of anything. They needed only to confirm that they had reached the same place. They had. The ghost hunter's shutdown mystery has been solved, and what it reveals about the 30-year investigation that Jason Hawes and Grant Wilson built is not a comfortable answer for anyone who spent 14 seasons watching them apply a rigorous, skeptical methodology to the most significant paranormal claims in the genre. The methodology worked. That is the answer. Not in the sense that it confirmed the existence of ghosts or demons or any of the specific categories of paranormal phenomena that the show investigated. In the sense that 30 years of consistent application of a rigorous debunking framework to a specific category of investigation, combined with the specific experiences that Jason Hawes accumulated at the New England location and at the unnamed northeastern location that produced the shutdown, produced a conclusion whose character is the reason neither Hawes nor Wilson has been willing to describe it publicly in the terms it deserves. What is living in the locations that ghost hunters investigated? What the TAPS methodology spent 30 years documenting and debunking, and occasionally failing to debunk? What Jason Hawes encountered directly at 2:53 in the morning on the 14th of November 2018 and again at the unnamed northeastern location 3 weeks before the shutdown is real. That is the answer the shutdown mystery has been pointing toward, and the specific character of its reality, what it is, what it wants, what the 30-year pattern in the TAPS archive reveals about its relationship to the locations where it is most consistently documented, is the information that Jason Hawes and Grant Wilson have in their possession, and that the decision not to continue Ghost Hunters was in part a decision about what to do with. The investigation is over. The information exists. And the two men who spent 30 years building the most rigorous civilian paranormal investigation framework ever produced for television are currently in possession of conclusions that the framework was designed to reach and that neither of them has yet found a way to share. Subscribe now and turn your notifications on. This story is not finished. There is a dimension of the Ghost Hunters shutdown story that the investigation's own history makes impossible to ignore. The show built its credibility on a specific promise to its audience, that what they were watching was real, that the methodology was genuine, that the conclusions reached were the honest product of rigorous investigation rather than the requirements of an entertainment format. That promise was kept across 14 seasons in ways the paranormal investigation genre had never previously managed. The audience that built itself around that promise deserves to know what the investigation ultimately found. Jason Hawes has that conclusion. Grant Wilson has that conclusion. The Taps archive contains the evidence that led to it. And the audience that watched 14 seasons of Ghost Hunters believing they were watching the honest documentation of a genuine investigation is owed the truth. The shutdown has been solved. The truth is what comes next.